We're now going to get into what I would call more of output based prompting. Okay, so we're going to talk about basically different types of output that you can ask the AI model to adopt. Okay, so we're going to talk about markdown. So at this point, we've talked a little bit about markdown, not in depth, but it's sort of been implied. Obviously, markdown is very popular with AI models. So if you're not familiar with why, you know what? Let's actually talk about a little bit about what markdown is. So this is markdown. So if you go to, for example, any of our lessons on takeoff, all of our guides below the videos, those are all written in markdown. And markdown is basically a markup language that has a very basic syntax. You get things like headings, you get bullet points. It's basically just a way to very easily style text, which is some very basic syntax. So the attached link, we'll put this in the guide below if you're not familiar with Markdown. But even if you're not familiar with the actual syntax of Markdown, you've undoubtedly seen it when Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or any of these really popular chat apps respond in their actual apps. They're typically by default going to be responding as Markdown because it ends up getting formatted very nicely in the area where the messages are rendered. So it looks really nice. And one of the reasons why models are so good at this is because models are trained on such a significant amount of markdown formatted documents, and in particular code, right? If you're somebody who's a developer, you obviously know about readmes and all of these forms of documentation that are written explicitly in markdown format. And so it's this very, very common form of syntax all across the internet that forms a significant amount of the training data of models. So the consequence of that is basically that models are really good at responding to markdown formatted instructions. Okay, so this is in this markdown lesson in particular, in the input for how you actually structure the prompt. If you structure it as markdown, it's actually going to positively affect your results, because just the models have seen so much formatting that's similar to it that they basically just are going to have a better grasp of knowing how to handle it. And similarly, not only is the input, the prompt, going to be nice, but it's going to be very reliable and very consistent when you ask for markdown formatted outputs. Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to go ahead and look at, we've kind of been doing a bad to good examples in kind of our first 3 lessons that we did. If you're skipping those, that's totally fine. You don't need to watch any of these or any of those. Again, the great thing about this section of the course is that you can skip around and only pay attention to what's interesting to you. But what we're going to do here is we're actually going to take a look at this system prompt in particular. So this, if you did go through the summarization lesson, this is going to look very similar because this is the prompt that we basically ended that lesson with, which is a very good prompt, but it's not formatted in Markdown. And we're going to format it in Markdown. Again, we're going to kind of emphasize some of the reasons why maybe you would want to do this. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So at the very top here, what we're going to do here is in Markdown, a single kind of pound symbol, single hashtag symbol, whatever you want to call it. If we refer back to our syntax guide, is you're going to see this is just an H1. So this is a header level 1. This is kind of your main header here. So this is going to be a number symbol with the title. So we're just going to say technical summary report, right? Because that's, if you read through this, you'll see that that's kind of the gist of what the prompt is. Okay, so we're sort of basically writing what the equivalent is of a code base repository README, which is just kind of an overall guide. We're almost kind of recreating that style of syntax as we're just taking the existing prompt that we have and we're just kind of adding some headers and some other sections like that, right? So it's actually pretty simple, right? In a lot of these cases, we're actually just going to basically take the anatomy of a good prompt and basically make the different areas of this prompt based on those, right? So we could just do an H2, which is just 2 of these. Okay, this is going to be header level 2. We're just going to call this a role. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for this one. This is kind of like background, so we'll call this background. Okay, this is the task itself. Okay, so we could call this like primary task or just task, whatever you prefer. This is going to be some requirements. So let's actually go ahead and do this. So I've mentioned this in previous lessons and I'll reiterate it in this lesson. Sometimes for requirements, what can be very helpful is formatting things as bullet points. And in this lesson, basically explicitly what we're doing is we're just making these instructions based on markdown, right? So in markdown, a bullet point is just a dash and then a space. And so if we were to paste this into a markdown editor, which we'll do at the end of this, just so I can show you what the formatting looks like, because in the OpenAI playground here, that doesn't actually come across. Right, we could do another one that's like make content accessible to software engineers and product managers. And I'm just going to stop there just because the purpose of this lesson isn't necessarily to show you an example of an output. We just want to show you how to format things, right? The markdown lesson, the XML lesson, and the JSON lesson are largely going to be formatting based, output formatting. And in Markdown's case, input formatting, just because formatting your prompts, which are kind of the input to the models as Markdown, helps steer positive responses. So, and then we could say, this is your output format. And I'm also realizing in requirements, we made that in H1 on accident. We want to make that in H2. And this does in fact matter, right? Because if you'd make this in H1, what happens here is it basically thinks that, okay, this is a header level 1. So it almost might even interpret this as one document and this is another document, when really, right, this whole prompt is supposed to be one document, right? So we got to make sure we are really good about getting the precise syntax of our markdown prompt correctly, okay? And this is something that's going to apply to both XML and JSON as well, which is that when you are working with these particular formats, because they have very strict requirements, you need to make sure that you're going slow enough that you can catch those errors. It's very important because if you do have accidental errors that are even, if they seem minor, they could actually end up vastly negatively affecting your outputs. Okay, so we want to be careful about that, right? And the same goes for output format. We could even do something like put the instructions here. You could almost like put this in a markdown code block. So 3 backticks with MD, and then 3 backticks at the end. Again, if some of this syntax is unfamiliar to you, that's totally normal, especially if you're new to Markdown. It can be a little overwhelming, which again is why we include this guide. It's very, very comprehensive. And again, one of the really great things about the AI models is they have a fantastic understanding of Markdown. So if you need to jump into ChatGPT or Claude or ask a model a question about Markdown because you're confused, or if you even just want it to, we talked in section 3 about prompt improvers and prompt generators. If you want to specify, hey, generate this prompt as a Markdown prompt, and you just want to give it, your current prompt, that we kind of started with, and just say, hey, make this Markdown, it can do that, which is really cool. So this really was all we needed to take the original prompt that we had and just turn it into a Markdown prompt, which it's kind of up to your use case of how much this is going to affect your outputs. I will say that defining your output format as Markdown is going to have much more of an impact than restructuring your input prompt is going to have on the result, right? Telling a model like, hey, I want you to format this as Markdown in a very specific way, that's going to be reliable. That's kind of the entire point of defining output formats. Input formats is just to kind of keep things organized. One of the things that you'll notice as you work with more and more complex long prompts is that formatting them as Markdown is not just useful for the AI model, but it's also useful for you. There's a very clear hierarchy and visual structure to it. It's easy to reference, all that kind of stuff. So me personally, I actually will almost 100% of the time format my prompts as Markdown. And then depending on the use case, maybe for the output format, I'll change. Maybe I won't use Markdown. Maybe, I'm working on a code generation use case and I need XML in the output format here, right? This would be like XML here, right? And this would be like, code gen request or whatever, and then I'd write my prompt here in Markdown, right? And so I'll quite often do something like that. You'll notice some of the prompts that we've used previously in, I think the summarization, simplification, and improvement prompts. We used a little bit of Markdown here and there. I think all of the output formats actually requested Markdown, but they weren't kind of the full prompt as an input wasn't necessarily completely formatted as Markdown. And that's fine. It's going to depend on personal style preference. It's going to depend on what kind of results you're getting for your specific prompt. But it's just a nice thing to know about. Again, I personally do almost 100% of the time use Markdown for my inputs, for my input prompts. And then I'll kind of vary the output format depending on what I need for that use case. So hopefully that is just a nice little brief introduction to Markdown prompting. You can kind of get as creative as you want with this. The more you learn syntax, the more you'll kind of get familiar with sort of what types of, if you want to get really, really specific with what kind of output format you want, for example, you can go ahead and look at, say you want block quotes, right? Say you're doing something that's some sort of a summarization prompt or something based on an article somebody wrote, and you want to make sure that in the summary, every time that the model references the original piece, maybe you want it to use a block quote. Well, now you can know, okay, cool, in my outputs, I can say, hey, use Markdown with block quotes anytime you reference a direct quote from the article, right? And then the model is going to know. So there's a ton of tools you can play around with here. It's just sort of a matter of getting up to speed with that. So I do recommend, take 10 to 15 minutes and just kind of go through this if you're somebody who's not familiar with Markdown, because this can actually be a total game changer for how you kind of think about structuring your input prompts and structuring your requested output formats.